She slammed her fist against the depot door so hard her knuckles split, and no one answered. The last train had gone. The platform was empty. Evelyn Harper pressed her back against that locked door, her single suitcase at her feet, and understood with terrible clarity that every promise made to her had just evaporated into the Montana air. No family, no money, no name in this town. Just a woman alone on a darkening platform at the edge of the known world, and the faint sound of a horse approaching on the road below. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to our channel and follow Evelyn's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The fist she drove into that depot door was not a desperate gesture. It was the last reasonable thing Evelyn Harper had left to try. She had knocked 3 times before that, politely the way her mother had taught her. She had waited. She had told herself the station master was simply delayed, that the crowd thinning around her meant nothing. That the figure she'd been watching for some cousin of a cousin, a man named Gerald Pratt, who'd written her a letter full of careful promises, was still on his way. She had told herself all of that while the platform cleared around her, one family at a time, one suitcase at a time, until the boards beneath her feet were empty and her own shadow stretched long and thin across them in the late afternoon light. Then she knocked again, harder and harder, and then her fist came down in a single blow that was less about anger and more about terror finding its only available exit. Nothing. She stepped back from the door and looked at it. Plain pine boards, a posted schedule half peeled from its nail, a small window with its shade pulled down on the inside. She pressed her fingers to the glass and looked through the gap at the edge of the shade, and she saw the chair behind the counter was empty. The logbook closed, the lamp unlit. The station master was gone for the night. Evelyn turned around and looked at the platform. She looked at her suitcase. Brown leather, one of the clasps repaired 3 times with wire because she hadn't been able to afford a new one. Inside it, 2 dresses, a winter shawl, her mother's Bible with the pressed flowers still tucked between the pages of Ruth. A small envelope with $11.40, every cent she'd been able to save in the 6 months since she'd sold the last of her mother's good china. She looked at the road that led away from the depot into Willow Creek. She looked at the sky. She did not cry. She had made herself that promise somewhere around Kansas when the train had rattled through the flat center of the country, and she'd had nothing to do but think about everything she was leaving and everything she was moving toward. She had promised herself she would not arrive weeping. She would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break before she'd even begun. So she picked up her suitcase, even though it was heavy, and her arm was still sore from the long hours of travel, and she walked to the edge of the platform and sat down on a bench that faced the road. She would wait. If Gerald Pratt had simply been delayed, he would come. If he was not coming, she would figure out what to do next. Those were the only 2 options she allowed herself to consider. What she did not allow herself to think about was the third possibility, the one that had been quietly forming at the back of her mind since the last passenger had stepped off the platform and nobody had called her name. The possibility that the letter had been a kindness someone couldn't deliver on. That Willow Creek, Montana, was not a new beginning, but simply the last stop on a long slide downward. That she had spent her last real money getting somewhere that didn't want her. She did not think about that. She looked at the road, and she sat very straight, and she waited. 2 hours passed. She knew because she had a small watch that had belonged to her father, a plain silver thing he'd carried for 20 years before his hands had gotten too weak to wind it. She'd wound it faithfully every morning since the day she'd taken it from his nightstand after the funeral. She wound it now automatically, though it wasn't yet time just for something to do with her hands. The sky had gone from gold to deep orange to the particular bruised purple that meant night was coming fast. Montana Territory, in the spring of 1885, did not ease its way into darkness. The sun went down, and the cold came up like something that had been waiting. Evelyn felt it first in her fingers, then in her shoulders, then in the back of her neck. She put her coat on. It was a good coat, wool, dark gray, the only thing she'd bought for herself in the past year, telling herself it was practical and not the small act of self-preservation it actually was. She buttoned it to the throat and tucked her hands in her sleeves and kept her eyes on the road. A wagon went by heading out of town. The man driving it glanced at her but didn't stop. A pair of men on horseback passed talking to each other, not looking at the platform at all. A woman with a basket hurried past and did look at her, a quick assessing glance that took in the suitcase and the bench, and the fact that Evelyn was clearly not where she was supposed to be, and then the woman's eyes went forward, and she kept walking. Evelyn watched her go. She thought about calling out, asking if there was a boarding house nearby, a hotel, a church that might have a spare room. She thought about it, and she didn't do it. There was a particular kind of shame in asking strangers for help when you hadn't yet exhausted every alternative. She hadn't exhausted her alternatives. She was still waiting. The situation was not yet desperate enough to warrant involving people who owed her nothing. She told herself that. She kept waiting. At some point, she realized she was hungry, which was absurd because it was the wrong thing to be focused on, and she almost laughed at herself for it. She'd eaten a small meal on the train 6 hours ago, a piece of bread and some dried apples she'd brought from St. Louis in a cloth. That was her last food. $11.40 in the envelope, and she'd been careful not to spend any of it on the train, because she didn't know how long it would have to last. She sat on the bench and was hungry and cold and waited, and the sky went dark, and still nobody came. She was in the middle of trying to calculate whether $11 would cover a week's lodging in a town she knew nothing about when she heard the hoofbeats. Not the quick, sharp clip of a horse in a hurry. Something slower. A working pace, the rhythm of a horse that had been ridden long and was heading home. She turned her head and looked down the road. A man on horseback came around the bend from the direction of town. He was riding a big bay horse built heavy in the chest, moving steadily. The man on his back was tall in the saddle, broad across the shoulders, wearing a dark coat and a hat pulled low. He had one hand resting easy on the reins and the other resting on his thigh, and he was riding the way. Men rode out here when they'd been doing it their whole lives without thinking about it, completely settled in the motion. He would have ridden right past. Evelyn could see it in the angle of his body. He was headed somewhere, looking forward, not at the depot platform, not at the woman sitting alone on the bench in the dark. He would have ridden right past, and she would have let him. Except that her suitcase chose that moment to tip off the bench. It hit the platform boards with a sound like a small explosion in the quiet evening, and the horse shied sideways, and the man pulled up short and turned his head. For a moment, they just looked at each other. The man on horseback. The woman on the bench with the fallen suitcase at her feet. She stood up. She didn't know why she stood up. It wasn't the polite thing necessarily. She just couldn't sit there and be looked at without standing. She bent and picked up the suitcase and set it back on the bench and straightened and looked back at him. He had the kind of face that was hard to read from a distance. Brown weathered a jaw that looked like it had opinions. He was older than she'd first thought. Not old, but not young. Somewhere in that territory where a man's face started telling you things his voice might never say. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the closed depot. Then he looked at the empty platform, the empty road, the growing dark, and the single suitcase sitting next to the single woman. He said, "You waiting for someone?" His voice was low and even. No particular inflection. A voice that was used to saying what it meant and not adding extra words around it. Evelyn said, "I was." A pause. "They didn't come," she said. Another pause. "No," he said. "I can see that." He didn't offer anything else. He sat on his horse and looked at her and seemed to be thinking something through. She got the impression this was a man who thought before he spoke, which was rarer than it should have been in her experience. Then he said, "Is there someone in town you can reach hotel boarding house, someone you know?" "No," she said. "I don't know anyone here." "You have money." She almost bristled at that. It was an intrusive question, but she could see in his face that it wasn't asked the way intrusive questions usually were, with that particular mixture of nosiness and judgment. He was asking because the information was relevant to the problem he was apparently deciding whether to help solve. "Some," she said. "Enough for a few days." He nodded. He looked at her suitcase. He looked at the dark sky. "There's a boarding house," he said. Mrs. Aldrich on Sutter Street. $2 a week includes breakfast. She's decent. How far is Sutter Street? Half a mile, maybe a little more. Evelyn looked at her suitcase. It was heavy. A mile was a long way with a heavy suitcase after a long day on a train. She looked at it and thought about the calculation. The $11 that had to stretch to cover everything until she could find work, and she thought that she should ask him how to get there and walk it herself. She was about to say exactly that. He said, "I can ride you to town. Your bag can go across the saddle." She looked up at him. "I don't need—" "I know you don't need," he said. He said it plainly, not unkindly, like he was simply agreeing with a statement of fact. "It's getting dark, and it's cold, and you've been sitting on that bench for—" He glanced at the sky. "Probably 2 hours. I'm going through town anyway." She wanted to say no. The word was right there, fully formed, completely available. She had been saying it for months every time someone offered something that came with conditions she couldn't afford. Help that wasn't really help. Kindness with a price attached. But she looked at this man on his bay horse in the gathering dark, and she couldn't find the price. She turned it over, looking for it, and it wasn't there. He wasn't leaning forward in the saddle with that particular kind of anticipation. He wasn't smiling. He was just sitting there waiting for her to decide, as if either answer was equally acceptable to him. She said, "Thank you. I'd be grateful." He nodded. He swung down from the saddle in a single motion, took her suitcase and tied it across the back of the saddle with efficient, practiced hands. Then he held the stirrup for her without making a production of it. She'd ridden before. Not much, but enough. She got up without help beyond the stirrup, which she got the impression he noticed, and filed away somewhere. He walked the horse. He didn't ride, he walked alongside, which meant she wasn't sitting on a horse being led like a package, but riding while a man walked her into town, which was somehow the difference between being managed and being accompanied. They didn't speak for most of the walk. Then he said, "Nathan Cole." "Evelyn Harper," she said. Another silence. Then he said, "You came from far, St. Louis." "Long way." "Yes." "The person who was supposed to meet you. I don't know what happened to them," she said. "I'm not sure it matters at this point." She felt him look up at her briefly, though he didn't turn his head fully. "Fair enough," he said. And that was all. Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house was a wide 2-story building that smelled of bread and lye soap. The woman herself was small and sharp-faced, and looked at Evelyn with the assessing eyes of someone who'd seen enough women arrive alone in Willow Creek to have developed opinions about which ones would last. Nathan spoke to her briefly at the door. Evelyn couldn't hear everything, but she heard Mrs. Aldrich say, "She have money," and heard Nathan say, "Enough, and she's capable, and I'll vouch for her," which was more than he'd been asked to say, and more than he'd been authorized to say, and which she hadn't asked him to say. She filed that away. Mrs. Aldrich showed her up to a room on the 2nd floor. Small, clean. A window that looked out over the back of the building and a narrow street. A bed with a heavy quilt, a washstand, a single lamp. It was the first private space Evelyn had had in weeks. She sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel for exactly 1 minute how tired she was. Then she stood up, washed her hands and face, and went back downstairs. Nathan was still in the front parlor, turning his hat in his hands. He looked up when she came in. She said, "You didn't have to vouch for me." He said, "I know." "You don't know anything about me." "No," he said. "But I know what I saw, and what I saw was a woman who didn't ask for help until she'd decided the situation genuinely required it. That's not nothing." She didn't know what to say to that. She held out her hand. "Thank you, Mr. Cole. Genuinely." He shook it. His hand was rough and large, and he shook it the way he would have shaken a man's hand, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. "You'll need work," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "There's a school teacher who left last month. Mrs. Aldrich would know who to talk to. And the Mercantile keeps books. I don't know if they're looking, but it's a place to start." She nodded. He put his hat on. He was going to leave. She could feel it. Then he stopped and said without looking at her, "The person who was supposed to meet you, Pratt." She went very still. "How did you know that name?" He turned to look at her then. Something moved behind his eyes. "Gerald Pratt has a reputation in this county," he said carefully. "He's made promises to more than one person he didn't keep." The room felt slightly different after that. The shape of what had happened to her rearranged itself just slightly into something uglier than a simple failure to show up. "Then it wasn't an accident," she said. "I don't know exactly what it was," Nathan said. "But I'd be careful about expecting him to make good on whatever he wrote in that letter if I were you." He said goodnight. He left. Evelyn stood in Mrs. Aldrich's parlor for a long moment after the door closed. Then she went to the window and watched him ride away down the dark street on his big bay horse. And she thought about what kind of person stopped for a woman alone on a dark platform out of nothing but the recognition of a situation that required stopping. She thought about what he'd said. A woman who didn't ask for help until the situation genuinely required it. He'd been watching her longer than she'd realized, long enough to reach a conclusion. She went back upstairs. She opened her mother's Bible to the page with the pressed flowers and read 3 verses of Ruth, the same 3. She always read when she needed to remember that starting over in a foreign place was not a new problem invented for her particular misery. She wound her father's watch. She put out the lamp. She lay in the dark in the narrow bed, under the heavy quilt in a boarding house in a town she didn't know, and she thought, all right, tomorrow. Start there. She slept. Morning in Willow Creek came with the sound of wagons and the smell of coffee and the particular noise of a working town that didn't wait for anyone to be ready. Evelyn was dressed and downstairs before Mrs. Aldrich had finished laying the breakfast table. Mrs. Aldrich looked at her over the edge of the coffee pot and said in the tone of someone revising an earlier opinion, "Early riser." "Always have been," Evelyn said. She ate quickly and efficiently and then said, "You mentioned last night there might be work available. I can teach, I can keep books, I can sew, and I'm a fast learner for anything I don't already know." Mrs. Aldrich set the coffee pot down and looked at her properly. "What did you do in St. Louis?" "Taught at a private school for 4 years. Kept my father's accounts before that." "Why'd you leave?" "My father died. Then my mother. There was nothing left to stay for." Mrs. Aldrich nodded slowly. There was something in the nod that wasn't quite sympathy, but was related to it recognition maybe. The acknowledgement of a woman who had also once been left to figure things out with no assistance. "The school board lost their teacher in February," she said. "Miss Garrison ran off with a telegraph man from Billings. They haven't replaced her. The children have been going to Mrs. Fowler, who is 70 years old and nearly deaf." She paused. "It's not a rich position." "I'm not looking for rich," Evelyn said. "I'm looking for viable." "Viable." Mrs. Aldrich considered the word. "I'll write you a note for Henry Marsh. He's chairman of the school board. No promises." "No promises," Evelyn agreed. "Just an introduction." She walked to Henry Marsh's office with the note from Mrs. Aldrich in her coat pocket, and 4 arguments prepared for the 4 most likely objections she'd identified during breakfast. She had spent the meal listening to the other boarders talk a traveling salesman named Kettrick and a young land surveyor who introduced himself as Tom Beasley, and she had asked enough questions to understand the basic shape of Willow Creek's concerns. The town was growing. Growing towns needed children educated. Educated children were the argument every parent made to every school board in every county she'd ever known, and she planned to use it. Henry Marsh was a heavy-set man with the look of someone who'd been a farmer before he was a businessman. Which was to say, he had no patience for performance and significant respect for directness. She was direct. She laid out her qualifications in 3 sentences. She laid out her availability and her flexibility in 2. She asked one question. What do the children here most need to learn that they're currently not getting? Marsh looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the note from Mrs. Aldrich. Then he said, reading comprehension. Half of these kids can sound out words, but they can't understand a page of text well enough to use it. That's a specific problem, she said. I can fix it. Give me 4 weeks and I'll show you the difference. 4 weeks. A probationary period. $15 a month, which was less than she'd made in St. Louis, but more than nothing, which was what she currently had. She accepted. She walked out of Henry Marsh's office into the spring morning, and she stood on the wooden sidewalk and looked up at the wide sky over Willow Creek, and she allowed herself exactly one moment of something that wasn't quite relief, but was adjacent to it. The recognition that the ground beneath her feet was solid, that she had found something to stand on. Then she went back to Mrs. Aldrich's to figure out what exactly she was going to teach on Monday morning. She didn't see Nathan Cole again for 5 days. When she did, it was unexpected. She was at the Mercantile picking up chalk and a handful of copybooks on the school board's account, and he came in for nails and a length of rope, and they nearly walked into each other in the doorway. He stopped. She stopped. "Miss Harper," he said. "Mr. Cole," she said. He looked at her at the chalk and the copybooks under her arm, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly. Something more like satisfaction. "School board took you on," he said. 4 weeks probation," she said. "I start Monday." He nodded. They stood in the doorway, and neither of them moved. Someone inside the store said, "Excuse me," and they both stepped aside, and then they were standing outside on the porch. He said, "How are you finding things?" "Manageable," she said. "Mrs. Aldrich's is comfortable. The town is stranger than I expected." "Stranger how?" She considered how to put it. "Everyone seems to know everything about everyone else, but they all pretend they don't." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the same family. "That's accurate," he said. "Is it always like that?" "Long as I've been here," he said. She shifted the copybooks. They were heavier than they looked. He noticed and said nothing, which she appreciated. He didn't reach for them or offer, just waited. She said, "You mentioned Gerald Pratt has a reputation. Would you be willing to tell me more about it?" "Not out of, I'm not looking for gossip. I need to understand what kind of situation I walked into." He looked at her steadily. "That's a reasonable thing to want to know," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." A pause. "Not here," he said. "Too many ears. If you have time Saturday morning, there's a ridge about a mile north of town where the county surveying records are posted. I need to check something up there anyway. The walk gives privacy." She recognized this for what it was, an offer being extended carefully with an exit built in for both of them. He wasn't inviting her somewhere socially. He was proposing a practical conversation in a location where nobody would read something into it that wasn't there. "Saturday morning," she said. "What time?" 7. "I'll meet you at the north end of Main Street." "I'll be there," she said. She went back into the Mercantile. He went in for his nails and rope. They didn't speak again, but when she was at the counter paying, she was aware of him at the other end of the store, moving quietly and efficiently, the way a man moved when he was comfortable in his own skin, and didn't need to take up more space than he required. She had met men like that before. Not many, but enough to know the type was real and rare and worth paying attention to. Saturday morning was cold and bright, the kind of spring morning that promised warmth later but hadn't gotten there yet. She was at the north end of Main Street at 5 minutes to 7. He was already there, standing with Ranger the bay horse and a second horse, a smaller sorrel mare already saddled. She looked at the sorrel. He said, "You said you manage on horseback." "I said I've ridden," she said. "I didn't say I was expert." "Dulce is easy," he said. She doesn't argue. "Unlike some horses." "Unlike Ranger," he agreed, which was the closest thing to a joke she'd heard from him yet. They rode out of town side by side at an easy pace. The country opened up around them, the way Montana country did, abruptly, completely like a door thrown wide. She felt it in her chest every time, that particular expansion, the sense of space that was either liberating or terrifying, depending on your state of mind. After a while, he said, "Pratt is a land agent. Mostly works the edges of honest, not quite fraud, not quite legitimate. He writes letters to people back east, promises situations that are close enough to real that they're hard to prove as lies. He brought in a half-dozen people in the last 2 years. Young women mostly. Told them there was respectable workhousing family connections. And some found their way, some left. One filed a complaint with the county sheriff, but there wasn't enough for charges. He paused. He gets paid by a man named Caleb Whitmore. Whitmore owns the biggest cattle operation in the county, and he's been buying up small land claims for the past several years. Some people sell willingly. Some don't get a choice. What does Whitmore want with young women arriving alone? She asked. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Cheap labor, he said. The kind that's grateful and doesn't ask questions. He runs a crew of domestics on his property. Pays almost nothing because the women he brings in have nowhere else to go. She thought about that. Pratt was going to deliver me to Whitmore. That was probably the arrangement, he said. Leaving you at the depot may have been his way of softening the offer, making you desperate enough to accept whatever was proposed. The simplicity of it, the plain business-like ugliness of it, was somehow worse than anger would have been. She wasn't a person who had been lied to. She was an inventory item that hadn't yet been delivered. She said, "Does anyone in town know about this?" Most people suspect. Fewer are willing to say so. He looked at her sideways. Whitmore carries a lot of weight in this county. He puts money into the church and the school fund and the road maintenance. He's not a man people challenge without careful thought. Are you challenging him? A long pause. I've been careful, he said. Which is not the same thing as silent. She nodded. She looked at the country around her and thought about the shape of the problem the way she would have thought about a snarled account book looking for where the number was off, where the lie lived in the column. She said, "He's going to want to know why I didn't end up working for him." Yes, Nathan said. He'll know you're here. He'll find out you got the school position. And that bothers him because a woman with the paying position and a respectable place in the community is much harder to put pressure on than a woman with nowhere to go. She turned that over. So by getting hired, I made myself a problem. You made yourself a person, he said, which amounts to the same thing for men like Whitmore. She looked at him then. He was watching the trail ahead, his hat pulled low against the wind, his hands easy on the reins. She said, "Why are you telling me all this?" I was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because you asked the right questions, and you didn't ask for reassurance. Most people who come out here want someone to tell them it's going to be fine. You didn't want that." "Is it going to be fine?" He looked at her. "I don't know," he said. "But I think you're the kind of person who'll make it one way or another. That helps." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in months. She didn't thank him for it. She just nodded and looked back at the trail, and they rode on in the clean, cold morning air toward the ridge where the county surveying records were posted, and Evelyn Harper began quietly, and without announcement, to understand exactly what kind of place she had arrived in, and what it was going to take to belong to it. The first time Caleb Whitmore spoke to her was on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks into her probationary period. She was walking back from the schoolhouse when his buggy pulled up alongside her, a big polished black buggy that was too fine for a working cattle ranch and was meant to be. He leaned out. He was a large man, handsome in a way that had once been striking, and now just looked like it was accustomed to attention. Gray at the temples, a coat that cost more than most men in Willow Creek made in a month. He smiled at her. "Miss Harper," he said. "I've been meaning to introduce myself. Caleb Whitmore." "Mr. Whitmore," she said. She stopped walking because stopping was the polite thing, and she intended to be scrupulously polite. "I know who you are. I hope good things," he said with the ease of a man who assumed the things said about him were always good. "People speak of you frequently," she said, which was true, and said nothing. His smile stayed. "I wanted to say I heard about your situation when you arrived. Left at the depot, no one to meet you. Terrible business. I hope you know that if you'd come to me, I would have been happy to help." "That's very kind," she said. "I run a large operation. I'm always looking for capable people. If the school position doesn't work out." "It's working out well, thank you," she said pleasantly. "The children are making real progress. I'm optimistic about the permanent position." Something shifted in his face. Barely. Just a slight adjustment in the eyes, the smile going from warm to something slightly cooler, though the shape of it didn't change. "Of course," he said. Willow Creek is lucky to have you." He tipped his hat. The buggy moved on. Evelyn stood on the wooden sidewalk and watched it go. She stood there until it turned the corner, and then she went to find Nathan Cole. Because Nathan Cole was the only person in Willow Creek she trusted to tell her whether what she'd just seen in Whitmore's eyes was what she thought it was. She found him at the livery, which was where she'd learned he went on Tuesday afternoons to check on a neighbor's horse. She told him what had happened. She was specific. She quoted the words exactly as best she could remember them, and she described the expression. Nathan listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "He knows you're not going to come to him on your own. He's deciding whether you're a problem he needs to manage." "What does managing me look like?" Nathan was quiet for a beat. "For now, probably pressure. Finding reasons to make your position at the school less secure. Talking to people on the board." He paused. "He won't do anything overt. He's too careful for that. He'll just make things harder." "Then I need to make myself harder to dislodge," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "I need to be better than just adequate. I need to be someone this town doesn't want to let go of." He looked at her with that steady assessing gaze. "You've got 3 weeks and some children who are reading better than they were," he said. "That's a start." "It's not enough," she said. "I need more. I need to know who sits on that school board, who they listen to, what they care about. I need to understand the full structure of how this town makes decisions." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's going to take longer than an afternoon," he said. "I know," she said. "But someone has to be willing to explain it to me." He said nothing. She waited. He said, "Saturday morning, same ridge." She said, "I'll be there." She walked back to Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house, and she sat at the small table in her room, and she opened the copybook she used for lesson planning, and she turned to a clean page. At the top she wrote, "What I know, what I need to know, what I need to do." She filled 2 pages. She went to sleep with the lamp still burning, and the copybook open beside her, and a plan forming itself out of the available materials of her situation. The way plans always had, not from comfort, but from necessity, sharpened to an edge by the specific nature of the problem. She did not feel afraid. She felt for the first time since the train had pulled out of St. Louis that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done. She didn't know yet that the man helping her make sense of it was fighting his own battle, quieter and older, and in some ways more stubborn than anything Caleb Whitmore had ever tried to build. She didn't know that yet, but she would. The Saturday sessions on the ridge became something neither of them named. Nathan would be at the north end of Main Street at 7. Dulce already saddled. Evelyn would arrive at 5 minutes, to which he came to expect, and they would ride out together in the early cold and talk through what she needed to understand about Willow Creek, its debts and loyalties, and the invisible architecture of obligation that held a small town together or tore it apart. She learned fast. That was the thing Nathan hadn't anticipated. He'd expected questions, but he hadn't expected the quality of them, the way she'd take something he told her, and turn it around in her mind, and come back with a follow-up that landed somewhere he hadn't thought to go. She connected things. A piece of information about the school board would get linked in her head to something about the water rights dispute he'd mentioned 2 weeks earlier, and suddenly there was a pattern he'd been looking at for years without seeing clearly. He found himself talking more than he intended to. He found himself looking forward to Saturdays in a way he hadn't looked forward to anything in longer than he could honestly remember. He didn't examine that too closely. He was a man who'd learned the particular discipline of not looking directly at things he wasn't ready to see. The 4th Saturday, she said something that stopped him mid-sentence. They were talking about Henry Marsh, the school board chairman, a man Nathan respected, despite his caution, and Nathan was explaining the complicated position Marsh occupied between Whitmore's money and his own conscience, when Evelyn said quietly, "You talk about everyone in this town like you understand them, but you talk about yourself like you barely exist." Nathan went still. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking out at the country, the way she did when she was thinking her hands easy on Dulce's reins. He said, "That's a strange thing to say. Is it wrong?" He thought about it. Honestly thought about it the way she somehow made him do. "No," he said finally. It's probably not wrong. Why? She said. And she did look at him then. He didn't answer right away. He looked at the horizon and found the words somewhere in the middle distance. After my wife died, he said, I found it was easier to be useful than to be present. You focus on the task in front of you, the fence that needs fixing, the neighbor who needs help. He stopped. It keeps things manageable. Manageable, she said. That's the word I used when you asked how I was finding things. Yes, he said. I remember. We're the same kind of stubborn, she said. Not unkindly, like she was identifying something in a ledger, naming a category. He almost smiled. Probably, he said. She turned back to the horizon, and they rode on, and neither of them said anything else for a while, but the silence was different after that, less the absence of speech, and more the presence of something that didn't need speech yet. He thought about that all the way home. I thought about it the next morning, and the morning after that. He was still thinking about it when everything started to go wrong. It began as trouble in small towns usually did with a rumor. Evelyn heard it from Mrs. Aldrich on a Wednesday evening, relayed with the careful precision of someone who wanted to warn without alarming. The story going around the story someone was telling was that Evelyn Harper had arrived in Willow Creek under false pretenses, that she had misrepresented her qualifications to the school board, that she had no real teaching experience, that her claimed position in St. Louis was fabricated, that she was, in the delicate language of the rumor, not the kind of woman a reputable community could rely on. Evelyn sat in Mrs. Aldrich's kitchen and listened to this, and felt a very specific kind of cold settle into her chest. Not the cold of fear, the cold of recognition. Who's saying it? She asked. Mrs. Aldrich set down her tea. No one who'll put their name to it. That's always how it starts. Whitmore, Evelyn said. Mrs. Aldrich didn't confirm or deny. She said, Henry Marsh came by this afternoon. He didn't ask for you, but he asked about you, whether you'd said anything to me about your history in St. Louis. What did you tell him? That you were the most straightforward person to come through my door in 3 years, Mrs. Aldrich said, and that I've had enough people come through my door to know the difference. Evelyn looked at her. Mrs. Aldrich was not a demonstrative woman. That sentence had probably cost her something. Thank you, Evelyn said. Don't thank me. Get in front of it, Mrs. Aldrich said. Tomorrow morning. Don't wait for him to come to you. She went to Nathan that night. She walked to his place further than was comfortable, but she'd been on Dulce enough times now to know the way, and knocked on the door of his ranch house. He opened it. He looked at her face and stepped back immediately wordlessly and let her in. She told him. He listened. When she was done, he said with a quiet and specific fury she hadn't heard from him before. He moved faster than I expected. I need letters, she said. References, from St. Louis. Can they get here in time? How long do you have? I don't know. Mrs. Aldrich thinks the board will want to discuss it by the end of the month. That's 3 weeks. A letter from St. Louis takes 2 weeks if the mail runs clean, he said. Then I need to send one tomorrow. You need to send 3, he said. Send to your former school, to a colleague who can speak to your work, and to whoever oversaw your father's accounts. He paused. You kept those records. Are there people who'd remember? Yes, she said. My father's partner. He's still in the city. Write all 3 tonight. I'll get them to the postal office first thing in the morning. She nodded. He said, the rumor doesn't have legs on its own. Whitmore needs someone on the school board to push it, which means someone on that board is already in his pocket or about to be persuaded to get there. He looked at her steadily. You need to know who that is before the meeting. How do I find out? You watch who starts being less warm, he said. Small towns. The temperature changes before the weather does. She thought about that. She thought about the school board Henry Marsh, and a hardware merchant named Darnell, and a rancher named Pike, and a minister's wife named Mrs. Calloway, who had always been the warmest of the 4. She said, Mrs. Calloway. Nathan looked at her sharply. What about her? She was friendly the first 2 weeks. The last few days she's been not cold, but careful. The way people get when they've heard something and they're deciding what to do with it. Nathan was quiet. "The minister," he said slowly. "Pastor Calloway takes a donation from Whitmore every spring for the church roof fund." The shape of it appeared clean and ugly. "So Whitmore goes to the pastor," Evelyn said. "The pastor says something to his wife. The wife brings her doubts to the board meeting. Without ever knowing they were placed there." She stood up. She needed to move when she was thinking. She crossed the room and came back. "All right," she said. "Whitmore is betting I can't prove my qualifications fast enough. So I need to do two things. Get the letters here in time, and make sure there are enough people on that board who know me well enough to wait for the proof before they vote." "You have 3 weeks," Nathan said. "Then I have 3 weeks to become indispensable," she said. He looked at her with that particular expression she'd come to recognize. Not admiration exactly, but something adjacent. The face of a man watching someone do the thing he'd privately bet they would. "What do you need from me?" he said. She thought about it. "Your credibility," she said. "You've been in this county your whole adult life. You know these people in ways I don't. I need you to be willing to say, if anyone asks, that you trust me." A long pause. "I do trust you," he said, simply, no performance in it. "I know," she said, "but I need you to say it where it counts." He nodded. She wrote the letters that night at Nathan's kitchen table, because she had better lamplight there than at Mrs. Aldrich's. He sat across the room and repaired a broken piece of harness, and didn't read over her shoulder or offer suggestions she hadn't asked for, which was precisely the kind of company she needed present without intruding. She wrote 3 letters. She was specific and factual, and she used names and dates and numbers because numbers didn't lie, and people who checked them found out quickly that she didn't lie either. She addressed them carefully and gave them to Nathan before she left, and he put them inside his coat like he was being trusted with something of value, which he was. She walked back to Mrs. Aldrich's in the dark. She was not afraid. She was angry, which was cleaner. The anger was useful. It burned off the fog of uncertainty and left her with the sharp-edged clarity of a woman who understood exactly what was being done to her and was not going to pretend otherwise or absorb it quietly. Caleb Whitmore had made a mistake. He'd assumed she was the kind of woman who could be undone by whispers. He'd assumed she had nowhere to stand. I was about to find out she had been building ground to stand on from the first morning she'd walked into Henry Marsh's office with a borrowed note and 4 prepared arguments. She just needed 3 more weeks. She was going to use every single day of them. The next morning, she arrived at the schoolhouse before any of the children and spent 40 minutes rearranging the seating to better accommodate the 3 students in the back row who had been struggling to see the board. Small thing. But one of those students was Thomas Darnell, son of the hardware merchant on the school board. And Thomas Darnell had been falling behind in a way that was starting to embarrass his father, who was the kind of man who took his son's performance as a direct reflection of his own standing. She had noticed this 2 weeks ago and filed it away. Now she moved Thomas closer, put a new copybook on his desk, and when he came in and looked at the arrangement with confusion, she said quietly, "I noticed you were squinting. Let's see if this helps." Thomas was 10 and had the guarded look of a boy who'd been told he was slow enough times that he'd started to believe it. He looked at the new desk position. He looked at the copybook. He looked at her. "The other teacher put me in back," he said. "I know," she said. "I think that was a mistake. Sit down and let's find out." By the end of that morning, Thomas Darnell had read a full page of text aloud without stopping. He'd stumbled twice, but he'd finished, and when he looked up at her at the end of it, he had the expression of someone discovering they were capable of something they'd been told they weren't. She said, "Well done." He said, "My pa says I'm not smart." "Your pa," she said carefully, "is working with old information." Thomas went home that afternoon and told his father what had happened. She knew he did because Darnell appeared at the schoolhouse door the next morning, before classes started hat in hand, with the slightly uncomfortable look of a man who had come to say something he hadn't quite decided how to say. She helped him. "He's not slow," she said before he got 2 words out. "He has trouble with visual distance. It's common and it's correctable. He's been misread." Darnell looked at her. "You figured that in a week?" 2 weeks, she said. "I wanted to be sure." He turned his hat in his hands. He said, "I heard some things about your background." "I know," she said. "I've sent for letters of reference from St. Louis. They'll arrive before the board meets. If you'd like to wait for them, I think the wait will be worth your time." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "My boy came home yesterday and sat down and read his Bible passage to his mother. First time he's ever done that without help." She said nothing. "That's worth something," Darnell said. He put his hat on and left. 1. She needed 3 out of 4. Marsh, she was less worried about he'd asked Mrs. Aldrich about her, rather than confronting her directly, which meant he was looking for a reason to believe, not a reason to dismiss. She would give him one. Pike she didn't know well enough yet. And Mrs. Calloway was the one being used as a vector for Whitmore's poison, which meant Evelyn needed to find a way to reach her that didn't feel like a campaign. People with integrity didn't respond to being managed. They responded to honesty. She went to the church. Not to Sunday service where the approach would be too visible. She went on a Thursday afternoon when she knew from Mrs. Aldrich that Mrs. Calloway helped arrange flowers for the following week's service. She didn't have a pretext. She decided not to construct one. She walked in and found Mrs. Calloway at the front of the church with an armful of spring branches, and she said, "Mrs. Calloway, I'd like to speak with you directly if you're willing." Mrs. Calloway turned. She was a woman in her mid-50s, soft-faced and sharp-eyed, the kind of combination that meant she was kinder than she looked and harder than she seemed. She looked at Evelyn with something that was almost relief, as if she'd been waiting for this conversation and hadn't known how to start it herself. "Sit down," she said. Evelyn sat. Mrs. Calloway kept arranging branches while she spoke, which Evelyn recognized as the habit of a woman who thought better with her hands occupied. "I've been told things about you," she said. "I don't know whether to believe them." "What were you told?" She listed them. The fabricated qualifications. The vague implication about character. Evelyn listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Mrs. Calloway finished, she said, "None of that is true. Letters are coming from St. Louis that will confirm it. But I'd like to ask you something first." "Ask," Mrs. Calloway said. "In the weeks I've been here, in your own observation, not what you've been told, have you seen anything that supports what you were told?" A pause. Mrs. Calloway's hands slowed. "No," she said. "Then I'm asking you to weight your own observation more heavily than the rumor," Evelyn said. "Not because I'm telling you to, because that's what your own judgment says." Mrs. Calloway set down the branches. She looked at Evelyn fully for the first time. "You know where this came from," she said. Not a question. "I think so," Evelyn said. "I'm not going to say the name in your church, but I'll say this: the person who put this in motion has been bringing women into this county for years under false pretenses and putting them to work for next to nothing. I was supposed to be one of them. I'm asking you to consider whether the person spreading doubt about my character is someone whose judgment you trust." The church was very quiet. Mrs. Calloway said, "My husband receives a donation from Caleb Whitmore every spring." "I know," Evelyn said. "He didn't tell me to say anything. He mentioned you and mentioned doubts, and I—" She stopped. Her face changed, not with embarrassment exactly, but with the particular discomfort of a woman recognizing that she had been used. "I drew my own conclusions." "I'm not blaming you," Evelyn said. "I'm just asking you to draw them again with everything in front of you." Mrs. Calloway was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Those children who can read better. My granddaughter is in your class." "Clara," Evelyn said. "She's extraordinary. Her comprehension is 2 years ahead of her age. She's been bored, which is why she sometimes causes trouble. She needs more material, not more discipline." Mrs. Calloway looked at her. Something in her face settled. "My daughter says Clara has been talking about you constantly," she said. "Clara talks constantly about everything," Evelyn said. "It's one of her better qualities." For the first time, Mrs. Calloway almost smiled. "Come to Sunday dinner," she said. "Not as a campaign, just come." "Thank you," Evelyn said. "I will. She walked out of the church and into the spring afternoon, and she let herself feel very briefly the particular exhaustion of a woman who has been fighting for 3 weeks on a dozen fronts at once. It settled into her bones, and then she straightened her spine and walked back toward the school because she had lesson plans to finish. She didn't know yet that Whitmore had noticed her moving, that he had watched the Darnell conversation from his buggy 2 streets away, that he was revising his assessment of exactly how much of a problem she was. She didn't know that he had gone that same Thursday afternoon to speak to Gerald Pratt, the man who was supposed to have met her at the depot. She didn't know what Pratt had said in that conversation, or what Whitmore had decided as a result. She would find out soon enough. Nathan found out first. He came to Mrs. Aldrich's on Friday evening, which was unusual. He never came to the boarding house. They always met at agreed-upon locations, and his coming to her door meant something had shifted. She saw it in his face before he said a word. He had the look of a man carrying information he wished he didn't have. Mrs. Aldrich let him in with the particular tact of a woman who understood the difference between propriety and necessity and left them in the parlor. Nathan sat across from her and said, "Pratt talked." She went very still. "Talked about what?" "He went to the sheriff, filed a statement claiming you approached him before you left St. Louis, that you paid him to bring you out here under false pretenses so you could claim the school position." She stared at him. "That's completely fabricated." "I know it is," he said. "He's inverting the entire thing. He's making me the fraud in his fraud." "Yes," Nathan said. "It's well constructed. It's the kind of lie that's hard to disprove because it takes the grain of true things. You did correspond with him. You did come here with the intention of finding work and twists them." She stood up. She couldn't sit for this. "What does the sheriff think?" "Tom Hale is a fair man," Nathan said. "He won't move on a statement without corroboration. But Whitmore knows that, which means he's looking for corroboration, real or manufactured." The room felt smaller than it had a minute ago. She pressed her hands flat on the table and thought hard and fast through the structure of the problem. "My letters from St. Louis," she said. "If they arrive before Whitmore can get anything else to stick." "That helps with the school board," Nathan said. "It doesn't help with the sheriff's statement. That's a different track." "What do I do about the sheriff's track?" He looked at her steadily. "You go to Hale yourself. You don't wait for him to come to you. You go tomorrow morning first thing and you tell him everything. What Pratt wrote to you, what was promised, what happened at the depot, and what you believe was intended. You get your version in front of him before Whitmore can build any more structure around Pratt's statement." "Will he believe me?" "Hale is interested in patterns," Nathan said. "He's a methodical man. If you go to him with a clear account that accounts for all the known facts, including the ones Pratt mentioned, and your account is more internally consistent than Pratt's, yes, I think he listens." She nodded. "Come with me," she said. He looked up. "Not to speak for me," she said quickly. "I'll speak for myself. But you said Hale respects you. Your presence says something even if you don't say a word." A pause. He said 7 o'clock. "I'll be ready at 6:30, she said. He almost smiled. "Of course you will," he said. After he left, she sat in the empty parlor and held herself very still and let herself feel for exactly the time it took to draw 3 slow breaths, the full weight of what was being done to her. The calculated, deliberate, resourced effort of a powerful man to destroy the credibility of a woman who had arrived in his county with $11.40 and the nerve to not fall into the position he'd prepared for her. 3 breaths. Then she went upstairs, opened the copybook, and wrote down everything she remembered about every letter Gerald Pratt had ever sent her. Dates, specific phrases, promises made. She wrote it all down in the clean, precise handwriting of a woman who had kept accounts for years and knew that details were everything when the broad strokes were being disputed. She wrote for 2 hours. When she was done, she read it back through and found one thing, one specific thing that she hadn't thought about until this moment. In Pratt's second letter, the one that had confirmed the travel arrangements, he had mentioned a name. A property. He'd described the work as in service of the Whitmore land operation, which is the finest enterprise in the county. He had named Whitmore in writing. She hadn't thought of it as significant at the time. She had thought it was simply a reference, a name drop meant to reassure her. She looked at the sentence she'd written down, reconstructed from memory, and she understood what it actually was. It was evidence of the connection. Pratt's statement to the sheriff attempted to sever the link between himself and Whitmore, to present himself as an independent actor and Evelyn as the initiating fraud. But if Whitmore's name was in the original letters that Link existed in writing, she needed those letters. They were in St. Louis. She didn't have them with her. She had not thought to bring them because she had not imagined she would need them. She sat with that for a moment. Then she thought, who did she know in St. Louis who might still have access to her things? The answer came immediately. Her father's business partner, Mr. Elias Fenn. She'd written to him for a reference letter. She'd written to him 4 days ago. The letter hadn't arrived yet, which meant she could send another one on the same mail run, asking him to go to the boarding house on Clement Street, where she'd been staying before she left, to ask Mrs. Hartley there to look in the tin box under Evelyn's bed for the bundle of letters tied with kitchen string. It was a long chain of reliance. Fenn would have to agree. Mrs. Hartley would have to cooperate. The letters would have to still be there. The mail would have to run clean in both directions. But it was not impossible, and it was the only thread she had. She wrote a second letter to Elias Fenn. Specific, urgent without being panicked. She told him what she needed and why, and she told him exactly where the letters were, and she trusted him, as she had trusted him for years, as her father had trusted him for a decade before that, to do what she asked. She sealed it. She addressed it. She set it on top of the copybook. She wound her father's watch. She lay in the dark. She thought about Nathan's face when she'd asked him to come with her tomorrow. The way something had moved through it before he'd agreed. Not reluctance. Something more like the expression of a man who'd been standing just outside a door for a long time and had just been given permission to take a step forward. She thought about what he'd said on the ridge. The distinction between being useful and being present. The way he'd managed for years to do the first without doing the second. She understood that. She understood it in the way you understood something that lived in your own chest. She had been doing the same thing since the day her mother died. Making herself useful. Making herself necessary. Making herself into a function rather than a person, because functions couldn't be abandoned the way people could. And here she was in Willow Creek, Montana, having been abandoned anyway, and the man who'd stopped to help her was a man who had hollowed himself out in exactly the same way. She didn't know what to do with that. She didn't know what either of them was supposed to do with that. But she lay in the dark and thought about it until she fell asleep. And in the morning, she was up at 6 and ready at 6:30 when she heard rangers' hooves on the street below. Sheriff Tom Hale's office smelled of old paper and pine resin, and the particular aroma of a space where serious things happened regularly enough that the room had absorbed it. Hale himself was a lean man in his late 40s, with a gray mustache and the careful, unhurried manner of someone who had learned that rushing to judgment was the fastest way to get things wrong. He listened to Evelyn for 20 minutes without interrupting. He made notes. He asked 3 questions at the end, each one precise, and pointed in a way that told her he'd been paying careful attention throughout. Then he looked at Nathan, who was sitting to the side with his hat on his knee, and said, "You have anything to add?" Nathan said, "She's told you what happened. I can only add that I was the first person she spoke to when she arrived, and that her account of that evening is consistent with what I observed." Hale nodded. He looked at the notes he'd made. "You mentioned a letter from Pratt that named Whitmore specifically," he said to Evelyn. "Yes," she said. "Those letters are in St. Louis. I've sent for them. I don't know how long the response will take." "The mail runs Wednesday and Saturday," he said. "If your letter got out yesterday, you might have a response in 2.5 weeks. He tapped his pen on the desk. "Pratt's statement was filed 3 days ago. Whitmore's been in my office twice since then. He's pushing for me to move on it." "He's using Pratt," Nathan said. It was the first thing he'd said without being asked, and Hale looked at him with the attention of a man who knew that Nathan Cole did not say things without reason. "Explain that," Hale said. "Pratt has a history of bringing people in under false pretenses," Nathan said. "This county has seen it before. Whitmore funds it and keeps his name out of it. This is the first time anyone's been in a position to connect the two in writing." He paused. "Which is why Whitmore wants this resolved before those letters arrive." Hale was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Evelyn. He looked at Nathan. He looked at his notes. "I'm not taking action on Pratt's statement until I've seen those letters," he said. "Both sets." He looked at Evelyn. Yours and Pratt's. I want the full picture. She said, "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "Get me that evidence." He stood, which was the signal the conversation was over. "In the meantime, Miss Harper, I'd suggest you continue doing your job. Nothing you've told me gives me cause to do anything other than keep investigating, and I intend to do exactly that." She walked out of the sheriff's office into the morning, and Nathan walked beside her, and she felt the particular sensation of a crisis that had not been resolved, but had been for the moment contained. Like putting a hand over a wound, the situation was the same, but the immediate threat of catastrophic loss was slower now. She said, "He believed me." "He believed the pattern," Nathan said. "You gave him a coherent account that fit everything he already knew. Pratt's statement doesn't." She looked at him. "You knew he was tracking Whitmore." "I suspected," Nathan said. "Hale's not the kind of man who takes Whitmore's donations and doesn't notice what they're for." She absorbed that. "There's more happening in this town than I knew," she said. "There always is," he said. "But you're inside it now." She looked at him. "Is that good or bad?" He considered that seriously the way he considered everything. "Both," he said. "Mostly good." They walked back toward the school because it was Monday morning, and her students would be arriving in 30 minutes, and she had a class to teach regardless of what was happening around her. This was, she had decided, the most important thing she could do: continue visibly and competently, as if she had already won. Because in some ways, she had to. The moment she looked defeated, the rumor would calcify into fact in people's minds, and no letter from St. Louis would dissolve it. At the corner where their paths diverged, Nathan stopped and said, "I'll ask around today, carefully. Pratt has been in this county a long time, which means there are other people with other stories. You're not the first woman he brought out here, and you won't be the last. If there's one person willing to speak to Hale." "That would change everything," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him in the morning light. He looked tired, she realized, not from lack of sleep, but from something older and more settled. The tiredness of a man who had been carrying something alone for a long time, and had only recently reluctantly started letting someone help. She said, "Nathan." He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "Not for any specific thing, for all of it." Howe was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his face, that closed door shifting very slightly on its hinges. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We're not through it." "I know," she said. "But I wanted to say it while everything was still uncertain. Not after, when it would look like gratitude for a result. This is gratitude for the effort." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he put his hat on and turned down the road, and she watched him go with the particular feeling of a woman who was beginning to understand that some of the most important things were happening in the silences between the conversations she was having. She turned toward the schoolhouse. 23 children were going to arrive in 30 minutes, expecting to learn something. She intended to make sure they did. Inside her, quietly and without ceremony, something had begun to settle. Not peace, exactly. Not security, but something that felt like the first solid footing in a landscape that had been nothing but shifting ground since the moment she'd stepped off that train. She didn't know yet what Whitmore would do next, when he realized the sheriff wasn't moving on Pratt's statement. She didn't know that Pratt, backed into a corner, was about to make a move of his own, one that would change the shape of everything and force a confrontation none of them had seen coming. But she had the children, and she had the copybooks, and she had the letters on their way from St. Louis, and she had a man down the road who showed up at 7 o'clock every Saturday morning without being asked. For now, that was enough. She opened the schoolhouse door and went in, and she was smiling, and it was real. The letters arrived on a Wednesday, both of them. Elias Fenn's reference and his second letter, the one she'd sent in panic the night she'd reconstructed Pratt's correspondence from memory, arrived on the same mail run, which meant Fenn had moved fast. Faster than she'd dared to hope. She opened the reference letter first, standing at the postal counter with Mrs. Aldrich beside her, because Mrs. Aldrich had developed what she called a practical interest in the outcome. The reference was everything she'd needed it to be: specific, dated, signed with Fenn's business address, and a notary stamp that would satisfy any school board in any county, in any territory. He described her work for her father's accounts over 4 years. He named specific clients. He mentioned figures. She folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket. The second letter was shorter. Fenn wrote that he had gone to Mrs. Hartley's boarding house on Clement Street the same afternoon her letter arrived. Mrs. Hartley had located the tin box. The bundle of letters was intact. He was sending them, not copies, the originals by registered mail under separate cover, and she should expect them within 2 weeks if the western routes were running clean. She stood at the postal counter and read that sentence twice. The originals. If those letters arrived, and if the sentence naming Whitmore was as specific as she remembered, the entire architecture of Pratt's false statement to Sheriff Hale would come apart at the structural level. Not because her version was more appealing, because the documentary evidence would contradict his account in a way that couldn't be explained away. She said to Mrs. Aldrich, "The originals are coming." Mrs. Aldrich said, "How long?" 2 weeks, maybe less." Mrs. Aldrich adjusted her shawl with the manner of someone squaring up for a fight. "Then we keep you standing for 2 more weeks, she said. "That's all." The problem with 2 weeks was what could happen inside them. Nathan found out about the originals that evening, and his reaction was not relief, but immediate concern, which told Evelyn something about how clearly he was tracking the situation. "Whitmore will find out the letters are coming," he said. "He has people at the postal office not on the payroll, just people who owe him favors. If he knows registered mail is coming for you from St. Louis, he'll know what it is," she said. "He'll try to move before it gets here." Nathan looked at her steadily. "I want you to think about what move he has left that he hasn't made yet." She thought about it. Pratt's statement hadn't gotten traction with Hale. The school board rumor was losing momentum. Darnell was now openly in her corner, and Mrs. Calloway had been warm at Sunday dinner in the way of a woman who had made a decision and was at peace with it. Marsh was waiting on the reference letters, which she now had. Whitmore was a man who'd been building something for years with patience and resources. He didn't operate through recklessness. Everything he'd done so far had been designed to apply pressure without leaving fingerprints. Pratt was the fingerprint, and Pratt was already a problem. She said, "He needs to discredit me in a way that can't be answered by a letter. Something that makes the letters irrelevant." "Yes," Nathan said. "What can't a letter answer?" A pause. "Character," Nathan said quietly. "Not professional character, personal. The kind of story that makes people uncomfortable enough that they stop listening to the evidence." She went very still. She thought about what shape that could take. A woman alone in a new town, seen frequently in the company of a man who wasn't her family. Not a crime. Not even technically a scandal. But in a community where reputation operated as currency, the right whisper at the right moment. "He's going to say something about us," she said. Nathan's jaw tightened. He might already be saying it. She looked at him. He was looking at the table. There was something in the set of his shoulders that she'd learned to read, the particular tension of a man who knew something. He was deciding how to handle the internal argument visible in the stillness. She said, "Nathan, what do you already know?" He looked up. "I heard something yesterday," he said. "At the feed store. 2 men I half know. They didn't see me come in." "What did you hear?" he told her, plainly without softening it. The story was that Evelyn Harper had come to Willow Creek specifically to pursue Nathan Cole, that her supposed teaching qualifications were a pretense for proximity, that the Saturday mornings on the ridge were something other than what they were, and that Nathan, a widower, lonely not young, had been deceived into providing her with shelter and credibility. She heard all of it. She kept her face neutral through the telling. When he finished, she said, "They're using you to get to me." "Yes," he said, "and using me to get to me." She understood that too. The story wasn't just an attack on her credibility. It was designed to make Nathan pull back, to make him feel that his association with her was damaging him, that the honorable thing, the self-protective thing, was to create distance. And if Nathan stepped back, she lost her most credible advocate at exactly the moment she needed him most. She said, "Will you?" He looked at her. "Will I what?" "Pull back," she said. "Step away. Decide it's not worth the trouble." The look he gave her was not offended. It was something quieter and more absolute. "No," he said. even if it cost you something. It's already costing me something, he said. People have been talking about me since the day I stopped at that depot. That's not new. A pause. I don't make decisions based on what people say about me. I stopped doing that a long time ago. She held that for a moment. Then she said, "All right. Then here's what I think we do." She laid it out for him. She needed to be seen publicly clearly, in contexts that were unambiguously professional, with multiple members of the school board over the next 2 weeks. Not manufactured appearances. Real ones. She was going to ask Henry Marsh if she could present the students' reading progress to the full board at their next scheduled meeting, which was in 10 days. She was going to make it about the children, and let the board draw their own conclusions about who she was. Nathan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "And me?" She had thought about that. She said, "Ing." He nodded slowly. "You've got this planned out further than I have," he said. "I've been thinking about it since before you told me," she said. "I saw the way Mrs. Calloway looked at me 2 weeks ago. I knew something was being built. I just didn't know which direction it was coming from." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected. "My wife's name was Clara," he said. She went very still. "She was 29 when she died," he said. "Fever. Went through the whole county that winter. 7 people died in 3 weeks. She was the last." He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his hands, which were flat on the table, the way hands went flat when the rest of you needed something to hold on to. "After that, I decided, not consciously, not as a stated thing, I just decided that I wasn't going to be the kind of person who needed anyone again. It's easier to be useful. You can control what you give, and you don't have to wait to see what comes back." She said, "I know." "I know you know," he said. "That's what I'm saying." He looked up finally. "Whitmore is trying to use me as a weakness in your position. But the reason it might work is because I've been letting myself care about how this turns out for you. More than I've cared about anything in a long time. And that's not something I know how to hide very well." The room was very quiet. She said, "I don't want you to hide it." He looked at her with the expression of a man standing at the edge of something he hadn't expected to be standing at the edge of. "Evelyn, I'm not saying anything that needs answering right now," she said. "I'm just saying I don't want you to hide it, whatever it is. Don't diminish it to protect me, because it doesn't protect me. It just leaves both of us standing further apart than we need to be." She paused. "Does that make sense?" He held her gaze for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "It makes sense." She stood up. "The board meeting is in 10 days, she said. "Let's get through that first." She left and walked back to Mrs. Aldrich's, and she was aware with each step of the specific weight of what had just happened in that kitchen. The thing Nathan had offered carefully, and without packaging it as anything other than fact, and what she had offered back, and the particular quality of the silence that had followed. She didn't let herself feel too much of it. There was too much else to manage, and feeling things too fully before the work was done was a luxury she couldn't afford. But she felt some of it. She was honest enough with herself for that. 3 days later, Gerald Pratt came to the schoolhouse. She didn't know he was coming. Nobody warned her. He simply appeared in the doorway at the end of the school day, when the last of the children had filed out, and she was erasing the board, and she turned around and he was there. She knew immediately who he was. Not from having met him, she never had, but from the quality of his discomfort. The way he stood with his hat in both hands, and wouldn't quite meet her eyes, which was the posture of a man who had done something he knew was wrong, and was trying to figure out how to be in the same room with the person he'd done it to. How was younger than she'd pictured. Maybe 40. The soft look of a man who'd spent his life doing other people's work without getting enough sun or satisfaction from it. She said, "Mr. Pratt." He flinched. "You know who I am." "I do," she said. She set down the eraser and stood at the front of the classroom and waited. He came in a few steps. He looked at the desks, the copybooks stacked on the shelf, the student work pinned to the wall. He looked at all of it like a man cataloging evidence of something he'd underestimated. "You actually teach," he said. "Yes," she said. "I actually teach." He swallowed. I didn't think when Whitmore tells you to bring someone out, you don't usually... He stopped. Started again. You were supposed to need him. That was the whole point. You were supposed to arrive with nothing and need him. I know, she said. He's angry, Pratt said. Not just about you, about the pattern. He thinks I brought you here on purpose, that I knew you'd be different. He looked at her finally directly. I didn't. I didn't know anything about you except that you answered the letter. She looked at him for a long time. She was trying to determine what this was, whether Whitmore had sent him, whether this was another move in a game she hadn't fully mapped. But the discomfort on his face was too specific to be performance. This was a man who'd been doing something bad for long enough that it had started to feel routine and had just been confronted with a version of the consequences he hadn't expected. She said, "What do you want, Mr. Pratt?" He said, "I want to undo the statement." She didn't move. Why? Because Whitmore is going to blame me for everything regardless, he said. He's already started. He's telling people I acted on my own, that he doesn't know why I brought you here, that I've been running my own scheme without his knowledge. He said it with the bitterness of a man who'd built a ladder out of another man's resources and was now watching it get kicked away. I've spent 8 years doing his work, and the moment it goes wrong, I'm the only one standing in the open. That must be very uncomfortable, she said with a precision that was not sympathy. He looked at her. He had the grace to look ashamed. I know what I did to you, he said. I know what I've done to others. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking whether there's a version of this where I tell the truth and it helps both of us. She thought about that. She thought about it very carefully, the way she thought about a ledger entry that didn't immediately make sense, turning it over, looking at what it connected to, what it would change if it were true. She said, if you go to Sheriff Hale and retract the statement, Hale investigates Whitmore directly. Is that what you're offering? I'm offering to tell them everything, Pratt said. The whole arrangement, how it worked, who paid me, what properties Whitmore was clearing people off, of which claims were legitimate, and which weren't, where the money went. He paused. I've been keeping records. She looked at him very sharply. What kind of records? Letters, he said. From Whitmore. Instructions. Some of them are specific about which claims he wanted cleared. Some of them mention the women I was supposed to bring in and what position they were going to be put in. He paused again. He wrote things down because he thought it gave him control over me. It didn't occur to him I might keep copies. The classroom was very quiet. She said, "Why are you telling me this? Why not go straight to Hale?" Because I don't know if Hale will protect me, he said. Whitmore has more reach in this county than people know. If I go to Hale and Whitmore finds out before anything formal happens, I need to know there's someone else who knows what I've told you, someone who can make sure the story doesn't get buried. He was asking her to be a witness, to be a safeguard, to absorb information that would make her dangerous to Whitmore, so that Whitmore would have a reason not to simply make Pratt disappear. She said, "You're using me." "Yes," he said, "but not the way I was supposed to." She held that for the moment. Then she said, "Go to Hale tomorrow morning. Tell him you want to retract your statement and that you have documentation regarding Whitmore's operation. Tell him everything you just told me." She paused. "I'll be there." He looked up. "You'll come. I'll come," she said. "Not for you. Because what you're describing is what happened to me and to others, and if the documentation exists, it should be in front of the sheriff. That's the only reason." He nodded. He looked very briefly like a man who'd just set down something very heavy and wasn't yet sure if he'd put it down in the right place. He left. She stood alone in the empty schoolhouse for a long moment. Then she walked fast to Nathan, because this was not something to sit with alone, and because Nathan had been part of this from the beginning and deserved to know before tomorrow what tomorrow was going to be. She found him at the fence line working on a post that had healed over in the spring mud. He looked up when he heard her coming and read her face immediately, because he'd learned to read her face, and he said, "What happened?" She told him, quickly with precise detail, the way she always told him things. He listened without interrupting, which was something she had come to rely on more than she'd expected, the simple fact of a man who listened all the way through before he spoke. When she finished, he said, "Pratt has letters from Whitmore." "With specifics," she said. If those letters connect to the fraudulent land claims... Nathan stopped. Something changed in his face. Something that wasn't surprise exactly, but was the expression of a man watching a pattern he'd suspected suddenly become visible all the way to its edges. She said, "What is it?" "The Henderson claim," he said. 3 years ago. A family came out from Ohio. Young couple, a child. They had a legitimate claim on 40 acres east of here. 6 months after they arrived, the husband was involved in an accident. One of Whitmore's cattle drives a horse spooked near his fence line. He broke his leg badly, couldn't work, the claim fell into debt. Whitmore bought the claim for almost nothing. Nathan looked at her. The husband always said the drive came too close to the fence on purpose. Nobody believed him. He had no proof. She understood. If Whitmore's letters document the pattern, if they show him ordering the same kind of thing done repeatedly, then the Henderson situation starts to look a lot less like an accident, Nathan said. And there are others. I've heard stories going back years. I never had anything to connect them. She said, "Come with me tomorrow." To Hale, he said. Yes, not just as a witness, as someone who knows the history, who can give the sheriff the other names, the other claims, so that when Pratt's documentation comes out, there's a framework to fit it into. Nathan looked at her. "You're not just trying to defend yourself anymore," he said. "No," she said. "When was I ever just doing that?" He was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his face, the door again shifting further. 8 o'clock, he said. 7:30, she said. He picked up his post driver. "I'll be ready," he said. She turned to go, and he said, "Evelyn." She stopped. "What Pratt told you tonight," Nathan said. "About using you as a safeguard. You understood what that means." "It means Whitmore knows by morning that Pratt has turned," she said. "Yes." "It means you become a target," he said. "Not the school board, not rumors, something more direct." She looked at him steadily. "I know. I want you to be careful," he said. "Between now and tomorrow morning." She understood what he was saying. She also understood that he was saying it in the only way he knew how, not with declarations, not with the emotional architecture that other men might have built around it, but with the specific and practical concern of a man who had decided without making a production of deciding it, that her safety mattered to him in a way that was no longer just neighborly. She said, "I'll be careful." She meant it. She went back to Mrs. Aldrich's and locked her room and sat with the lamp burning low and thought about the shape of things. About Gerald Pratt, standing in the schoolhouse doorway with his hat in both hands, 8 years of wrong choices visible in his posture. About Nathan at the fence line in the failing afternoon light, the moment his face had changed when she'd mentioned the Henderson claim. About the way this town's injuries were connected, the women brought in without warning, the families edged off legitimate claims. The money flowing steadily in one direction, and how Whitmore had kept it all separate, kept the threads from touching, until one woman arrived at a depot with $11.40 and refused to be where she was put. She hadn't planned to unravel anything. She had just refused to fall. It turned out those were the same thing. The morning came cold and clear, and she was dressed and downstairs before Mrs. Aldrich had lit the kitchen lamp, and when the older woman came in and saw her sitting at the table fully dressed with her copybook open, she said, "Today's the day." "Today's a day," Evelyn said. "Might be the most important one." Mrs. Aldrich made coffee and didn't ask for details, which was one of the things Evelyn had come to value most about her. The instinct for when information was needed and when presence was the only thing required. She drank the coffee and reviewed her notes, and at 7:15 she heard Ranger outside. She put on her coat. She picked up the copybook and the reference letter from Fenn and the folder where she'd written everything she remembered about Pratt's original correspondence, every date and phrase and implication she'd reconstructed from memory. She went out. Nathan was on the street with Ranger and Dulce, the little sorrel that didn't argue, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the ridge that first Saturday, fully directly with the particular attentiveness of a man who was being honest with himself about what he was looking at. She said, "Ready." He said, "You." She looked at him and felt very clearly the truth of her own answer. "Yes," she said. "Let's go." They rode toward the sheriff's office through the early morning streets of Willow Creek, side by side, and the town was just beginning to wake around them. Smoke from chimneys, the sound of a door, a dog barking twice and going quiet. And she was aware with the clarity that came in moments before important things happened, that whatever came next, she was not facing it from the edge of the platform anymore. She was facing it from the ground. Her ground. Ground she had built piece by piece with her own hands in the weeks since a suitcase had fallen off a bench and a man on a bay horse had stopped and looked at her and decided not to ride on. She kept her eyes forward. She was ready. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that Gerald Pratt had not slept the night before. That he had spent those hours pacing in his rented room above the saloon, convinced by the growing hours of darkness that confessing to Hale was a death sentence rather than a lifeline. That by 6 o'clock in the morning he had made a different decision entirely. And that decision was walking through the door of Caleb Whitmore's ranch house at the precise moment Evelyn and Nathan were riding toward the sheriff's office on the other side of town. Sheriff Hale's office was empty when they arrived. Not just Hale. The whole building had the specific quality of a space recently vacated in a hurry. The door was unlocked. The lamp on the desk had been left burning. A coffee cup sat on the edge of the blotter with steam still rising from it, and the logbook was open to that morning's date with 2 lines written and then stopped mid-sentence, the pen still resting across the page where it had been set down fast. Nathan read the room in about 4 seconds. He said, "Something happened." Evelyn was already at the desk, looking at the logbook without touching it. The 2 written lines were a time notation, 6:42, and the beginning of an entry. She couldn't fully make out, but the words Whitmore and Ranch were visible in Hale's cramped hand before the sentence cut off. She said, "He went to Whitmore's." Nathan turned. "Before us." "Pratt," she said. "Pratt went to Whitmore last night instead of waiting for this morning. Whitmore sent for Hale." She looked up. "Whatever Pratt told him, Whitmore used it to get ahead of us." She watched Nathan's face process the quick inward calculation of a man who trusted his own judgment and was now running through what the new information changed. He said, "How long ago did Hale leave?" She touched the side of the coffee cup. "Warm, but not hot. 20 minutes, maybe 30. Whitmore's ranch is 4 miles out," Nathan said. "If we go now." "We go now," she said. They didn't discuss it further. She was on Dulce before Nathan had finished the sentence, and they rode out of town at a pace that was not quite a gallop, but was everything short of it. And the morning air hit her face cold and clean, and she leaned into it and didn't think about what they might be riding toward. She thought instead about the logbook entry. The specific words. Whitmore and Ranch, and the sentence that hadn't been finished. Hale had gone quickly enough to leave the lamp burning and the pen on the page, which meant someone had come for him rather than called. And whoever came had been persuasive enough to pull him out of his office before he'd finished recording the reason. That was not how Hale operated. She'd sat across from the man. He was methodical to his bones. You didn't pull Tom Hale away from his logbook without giving him something that felt to him like an emergency. The question was, what emergency Whitmore had constructed. She found out when they came over the last rise before Whitmore's property and saw the scene already assembled below them. Hale's horse tied at the post, 2 of Whitmore's ranch hands standing outside the main house with the particular posture of men performing neutrality, and Gerald Pratt sitting on the steps of the porch with his hands between his knees and an expression on his face that she couldn't read from this distance, but that she recognized by its shape. That was the face of a man who had made a choice and was already living with it. She pulled Dulce up. Nathan stopped Ranger beside her. He said quietly, "They've already been talking." "Yes," she said. "We need to get in there." Hale may not want. Hale left his office in a hurry based on something Whitmore told him, she said. He's heard one version. He needs to hear another one before he decides what to do with it. She looked at Nathan. "Are you with me?" He didn't hesitate. "Ride down," he said. They rode down. The 2 ranch hands moved together when they saw the horses approaching the automatic consolidation of men who'd been told to manage the perimeter. One of them held up a hand. "Private business," he said. "Mr. Whitmore's not receiving." "That's fine," Nathan said pleasantly. "We're here to see Sheriff Hale." A beat. The hand was still up. "The sheriff's in a meeting. Then we'll wait," Nathan said. He swung down from Ranger and tied the horse at the post with the calm of a man who had decided the conversation was already over and they were moving to the next phase. Evelyn dismounted beside him. She looked at Pratt on the steps. He was looking back at her with the expression she now recognized he'd told Whitmore. Not everything she could see from the shape of his guilt, that it wasn't total confession, but enough. Enough to give Whitmore something to work with. She said directly to Pratt, and not quietly, "What did you tell him?" Pratt flinched. The ranch hands looked between them. Pratt said low, "I had to." "What did you tell him?" she said again. Not louder, just clearer. Pratt looked at his hands. "I told him you knew about the letters, that you were going to Hale this morning." He stopped. "I didn't tell him what was in them. I swear I didn't tell him that." "Why not?" "Because they're the only thing keeping me safe," Pratt said, and there was nothing in his voice now except the bare arithmetic of a frightened man. "If Whitmore knows I have documentation, he has a reason to. I needed something to hold back." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She felt Nathan beside her, steady and quiet, waiting. She made a decision. She walked up the porch steps past Pratt and knocked on the door of Caleb Whitmore's house. One of the ranch hands said, "Ma'am." The door opened. Whitmore was standing just inside, which meant he'd seen them ride up and had been waiting. He was dressed for the day, fine coat, polished boots, and he had the controlled expression of a man who had woken up this morning to an inconvenient problem and had been working on managing it since before sunrise. Sheriff Hale was visible behind him in the entry hall, still in his riding coat, holding his hat. Whitmore said, "Miss Harper, I wasn't aware you'd been invited." "I wasn't," she said, "but I'd like to speak with Sheriff Hale." Hale stepped forward before Whitmore could reply. He had the look of a man who had been in the middle of sorting through something complicated and was not unhappy to be interrupted. "Miss Harper," he said. "Mr. Cole, step inside." Whitmore's expression didn't change. He stepped back. He had too much practice at control to show the thing he was actually feeling, but she could see it in the set of his jaw, the specific tightening of a man who'd wanted 30 more minutes and wasn't going to get them. They went inside. The four of them stood in Whitmore's front room. Evelyn, Nathan Hale, and Whitmore, and it was the first time she had been in the same space as Whitmore with Nathan beside her, and she was immediately aware of the different quality it created. Not because Nathan was large or because there was any threat in the air. It was something more specific, the difference between a man choosing a solitary target and a man confronting two people who had clearly been thinking together. Whitmore was recalculating. She could see him doing it. Hale said, "Mr. Whitmore brought me out here this morning to share some concerns about the registered mail coming in from St. Louis." She looked at Hale steadily. "What concerns?" "He has reason to believe the documents being sent may be fraudulent," Hale said. He said it flatly, without inflection, the way a man stated something he hadn't yet evaluated. Specifically, that letters purportedly from a business associate in St. Louis were fabricated to support a false account. She kept her eyes on Hale, not on Whitmore. "By whom?" she said. "Who fabricated them?" "That's the claim being made," Hale said. He glanced at Whitmore, then back at her. "I haven't reached any conclusion." "Then let me help you reach one," she said. She opened her coat and took out the folder she'd carried all morning, the reconstructed account of Pratt's letters, the reference from Fenn, the details she'd written down the night after the sheriff's first interview. She put it on the side table because there was nowhere else to put it. "Those are my notes on every communication I received from Gerald Pratt before I left St. Louis. Dates, specific language, the promise of legitimate employment, and the name Whitmore appears in the second letter as the employer I was being delivered to." She looked at Hale. "I reconstructed those from memory. The originals are in the registered mail. When they arrive, you'll be able to verify the reconstruction against the originals, and you will find they match." A silence. Whitmore said, "A woman who's fabricating documents would say exactly that." She looked at him then, directly, without anger, because anger was what he wanted from her. Anger made her look reactive, emotional, the kind of woman whose account could be attributed to agitation rather than fact. She looked at him with the calm of a woman who knew her ground. She said, "Mr. Whitmore, you've been trying to manage me for 2 months. You used Pratt to file a false statement. You used Pastor Calloway's donation to plant doubt with the school board. You drove out to the fence line of the Henderson claim 3 years ago, and you know exactly what happened to that family." She paused. "I don't have everything yet, but I have enough of it, and what I don't have yet is on its way." The room was very quiet. Nathan said nothing. He didn't need to. He was simply present, standing at her left shoulder, and his presence said the thing she didn't need to say in words. She was not alone, and the man standing with her had been in this county for 20 years and knew where every body was buried, figuratively speaking, and was not afraid of Caleb Whitmore. Hale looked at Whitmore. "You want to respond to that?" Whitmore was quiet for exactly 2 seconds too long. A man with a clean conscience responded immediately. A man running a calculation took 2 seconds. She watched Hale notice it. Whitmore said, "This woman has a habit of making accusations she can't support." "She supported one just now," Hale said mildly. "The Henderson claim. You want to tell me about that?" The temperature in the room changed. Whitmore said, "That claim was a legitimate purchase. Tobias Henderson sold it voluntarily. After his leg was broken in an incident involving your cattle drive," Nathan said. It was the first time he'd spoken since they came inside, and the quiet certainty of it landed in the room like a stone into still water. Whitmore looked at him. Something genuine moved through his expression. Then, not fear, not quite, but the thing that came before fear, in a man who'd never had real reason to feel it. Recognition. The specific recognition of a man who had underestimated a situation and was just now seeing the full dimensions of it. He said, "Nathan Cole has had a grudge against me for years." "Yep," Nathan said. "On account of watching you do things that needed doing differently. That's not a grudge, that's a record." Hale looked between them. He looked at the folder Evelyn had put on the side table. He looked at Whitmore. He said, "Mr. Whitmore, I'm going to need you to sit down. Miss Harper, Mr. Cole, if you could step outside for a few minutes." She looked at Hale. He gave her the smallest nod, barely perceptible, but she'd gotten good at reading small signals, and she understood. He was clearing the room to talk to Whitmore directly without an audience, which was how Hale worked when he'd made a preliminary judgment and was moving to confirm it. She and Nathan stepped back out onto the porch. Pratt was still sitting on the steps. He looked up at them and said, "What happened in there?" "You'll find out soon enough," Nathan said. Pratt looked at Evelyn. "Did I ruin it?" he said. "Coming here last night. Did I ruin everything?" She thought about it honestly. "You made it harder," she said. "I don't know yet whether you ruined it." He put his head in his hands. She watched him and felt the thing she hadn't expected to feel, not sympathy exactly, but the recognition that Gerald Pratt was also a piece of Whitmore's machinery, a man who'd spent 8 years being useful to someone who'd never intended to protect him, and had finally reached the moment where the machinery was eating him too. She said, "The letters you kept, where are they?" He looked up. "Safe place, not here. When Hale asks you for them," she said, "you give them to him, all of them, not as a bargain. You give them freely and completely. Do you understand?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Why are you telling me how to do this right?" "Because if you do it wrong," she said, "they don't help anyone, including you." He nodded slowly. Nathan had moved to the edge of the porch. He was looking toward the road, and she came to stand beside him, and they waited in the clean morning air, with the sound of voices murmuring inside the house, and she thought about what was happening on the other side of that door. Hale and Whitmore. The specific reckoning of a man being asked to account for years of careful, profitable small-town violence, and she thought, this is what it takes. Not a single dramatic moment. This. The accumulated weight of a woman who wouldn't fall over the record, kept by a man who refused to forget the paper trail, maintained by a frightened middleman, who was finally more afraid of being buried than of coming clean. Nathan said quietly, "You're all right." She looked at him. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "Good." They stood together and waited. Hale came out 20 minutes later. He had the look of a man who'd gotten more than he'd arrived expecting. which was the look Tom Hale wore when an investigation that had been moving slowly had just found its footing. He said to Evelyn, "I'm going to need a full formal statement. Everything from the correspondence in St. Louis to this morning." "I can do that today," she said. He looked at Pratt. "Mr. Pratt, the letters you've kept, I want them on my desk by end of day." Pratt swallowed hard, looked at Evelyn, looked at Hale. "Yes, sir," he said. Hale looked at Nathan. "Cole, the Henderson claim and whatever else you know, I want you in my office Thursday." "I'll be there," Nathan said. Hale looked toward the house. "Whitmore's not going anywhere," he said. "Not because I've charged him with anything, not yet. But he knows the shape of where this is going." He paused. "The registered mail arrives Wednesday. I'll be at the postal office when it does." He put his hat on and walked to his horse. She watched him go and felt the specific cautious quality of a battle that wasn't won but had turned. The moment when the ground shifts beneath a fight and you can feel, not see that the direction has changed. She turned to Nathan. He was watching her with that expression she'd been cataloging since the first Saturday on the ridge, the one that was not quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. She said, "Thursday you're giving your statement." "Yes," he said. "The Henderson claim," she said. "You've been carrying that for 3 years." "Longer," he said. She looked at him steadily. "After Thursday," she said. "After the letters arrive and Hale has what he needs. Then what?" He held her gaze. Something in his face moved, not the careful door that might open, but the door itself finally, and without calculation, taking one clear inch of space. He said, "I'd like to find out." She said, "So would I." They rode back to town. She went to the sheriff's office and gave her formal statement, 3 hours of careful, sequential documented account that Hale recorded in full. She quoted Pratt's letters from her reconstruction with the confidence of a woman who had been keeping accounts for years and knew exactly how to be precise. She named dates. She named figures. She described the depot, the platform, the locked station master's door, and she described Nathan pulling up on Ranger in the dark and asking if she was waiting for someone. She described everything. Hale filled 10 pages of his logbook. She walked out of the sheriff's office at 2:30 in the afternoon. She was tired in the bone-deep way that came not from physical exertion, but from the sustained effort of carrying something important with complete concentration. The kind of tired that only came when the concentration was finally no longer required. She sat on the bench outside the sheriff's office, the first bench she'd sat on since the one at the depot, and she let herself breathe. Mrs. Aldrich appeared from across the street. Not coincidentally, she had the look of a woman who had been watching the sheriff's office since mid-morning and had timed her approach with precision. She sat down beside Evelyn. She said, "Well?" Evelyn said, "I think it's going to be all right." Mrs. Aldrich made a sound that was half satisfaction and half the specific grunt of a woman who had been convinced of this for some time but appreciated the confirmation. Then she said, "Henry Marsh has been asking about you. The board meeting is in 4 days." "I know," Evelyn said. "The reference letters from St. Louis. Presented them this morning. Marsh is satisfied." She paused. "The registered mail arrives Wednesday. Whatever is in it is going to matter more for Hale than for the board." She looked at Mrs. Aldrich. "I think the board is already done." Mrs. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Nathan Cole came by the house while you were in there. Didn't ask for you. Just wanted to know you'd arrived." Evelyn looked at her hands. "He's a good man," Mrs. Aldrich said. The way she said it was not a statement. It was an observation submitted for consideration carefully and without pressure. "I know," Evelyn said. "Men like that don't come along regularly," Mrs. Aldrich said. "And when they've been hurt the way he's been hurt, they don't come back easy. It takes—" She stopped. "It takes someone who doesn't need them to be anything other than what they are." Evelyn looked at her. Mrs. Aldrich was looking at the street. Her profile was the profile of a woman who had her own history, her own version of this particular knowledge. "Are you talking about him or about me?" Evelyn said. Mrs. Aldrich stood up. "Both of you," she said. "That's usually how it works." She straightened her shawl. "Come home and eat something. You look like you've been running on nerves since 6 this morning. She had been. She went home and ate and sat at her table and did not open the copybook and did not think about tomorrow or Wednesday or the board meeting or the registered mail. She sat with her hands flat on the table and let herself be still, which was something she was still learning, the practice of stopping without guilt of being a person, rather than a function of allowing herself to occupy space without immediately justifying the occupation. She was getting better at it. Wednesday came with a hard spring rain that meant the mail ran late. She taught her morning classes with complete attention, because the children deserved her attention, regardless of what was happening in any other part of her life. And Thomas Darnell read aloud for the 3rd time without stopping, and the class applauded him, which made him go red to the ears in a way that was entirely worth seeing. The mail arrived at 1:30. Hale was at the postal office as promised. She didn't go, because she had decided that going would look like anxiety she didn't feel and had no reason to perform. She had sent the letters. Elias Fenn had found the originals. They would say what she knew they said. She didn't need to watch them be opened. Hale came to her at the schoolhouse at 4 o'clock when the children had gone. He walked in and set a flat package on her desk. "Your originals," he said. "I've made copies for the record." He looked at her. "The letter naming Whitmore." She waited. "It's there," he said. "Specific and dated. Pratt's statement to me described a version of events in which Whitmore's name never appears. The original letter places Whitmore as the directing party of the entire arrangement." He paused. "Combined with Pratt's documentation, which he delivered in full, all of it apparently, without holding anything back, I have enough to move." She looked at him steadily. "Move how?" "A formal investigation," he said. "The territorial court will be involved. It's going to take time. These things always take time." He picked up his hat. "But Whitmore knows the investigation is coming. He knows the shape of what Pratt handed over." He paused in the doorway. "A man like Whitmore doesn't fight a losing battle publicly. He settles." She said, "The Henderson claim will be part of what's examined," Hale said, "along with several others. Cole's statement on Thursday will matter there." He left. She sat alone in the empty schoolhouse and let the full weight of the past 2 months settle through her, the depot platform in the dark, the locked door, the $11.40. The cold walk to Mrs. Aldrich's behind a man on a bay horse who hadn't made her feel like a charity case or a problem to be managed, but simply like a person in a situation that required addressing. She felt for the first time since she'd left St. Louis something she recognized with some surprise as peace. Not the absence of difficulty. There was still the board meeting, still the investigation, still the 100 practical things that made up a life being built from almost nothing. But beneath all of that, a settled quality, a sense of standing on ground that held. She was still sitting there when she heard footsteps on the porch. Nathan. She knew before she looked up. She knew by the particular quality of the footstep, unhurried, even the walk of a man who was not in a hurry because he'd already decided where he was going. He came in and looked at the package on her desk and read her face. "The letters," he said. "Everything I needed," she said. He nodded. He came and sat in one of the student chairs too small for him, which would have looked absurd on anyone else, and somehow didn't on him. And he looked at her the way he had on the ridge that first Saturday, before he'd said anything about Clara, before she'd said anything about wanting him to exist fully rather than just usefully. He said, "Hale told me, on my way in." "Thursday still," she said. "Your statement." "Thursday," he agreed. A silence, not uncomfortable. The particular silence they'd developed over weeks of Saturday mornings, the one that meant both of them were present, and neither of them needed to fill the air to prove it. He said, "After Thursday, after all of it settles." She looked at him. She waited. "I'd like to take you to dinner," he said. "Not on the ridge, not at Mrs. Aldrich's table. Somewhere in town where people can see so that whatever story Whitmore started gets replaced by a different one." She felt something warm move through her chest, which she allowed without apology. She said, "That sounds like a declaration." "It is," he said. He said it without flinching, without qualification, with the directness of a man who had been building up to a thing for a long time, and had finally decided that the building was done. She looked at him. She thought about the man she'd watched on that first Saturday, hollowed out useful, keeping everyone at the precise distance where he could help them without being touched. She thought about what it had cost him these 2 months to let the distance close, to step forward, to speak. She said, "Yes, I'd like that very much." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he stood up, and his face had the expression of a man who had done a hard thing and found it was less hard than he'd feared, and also somehow more in the way that things that mattered always were. He said, "I'll see you tomorrow." She said, "Good night, Nathan." He put his hat on and left. She sat alone in the schoolhouse with the original letters on the desk in front of her, and the full, real weight of 2 months settled into her bones, and she felt the specific, undeniable sensation of a life that had been moving in pieces, beginning with great care and no guarantee to fit together into something whole. She wound her father's watch. She went home. Nathan's statement to Sheriff Hale lasted 4 hours. Evelyn knew this because she counted. She taught her morning class, she ate lunch at Mrs. Aldrich's table without tasting it. She graded the reading exercises Thomas Darnell had completed with the focused intensity of a boy who had recently discovered he was not stupid, and she watched the clock on the wall and counted the hours since Nathan had walked into the sheriff's office at 8 in the morning. He came to the schoolhouse at 12:30. She heard the door and looked up, and she could tell immediately not from his face, which was composed, but from the way he carried himself. Slightly lighter. The particular quality of a man who has been holding something for a long time and has finally set it down in the right place. She said, all of it, he said. The Henderson claim. 2 others I'd heard about but hadn't been able to confirm. Hale already had corroboration on one of them from Pratt's documentation. He sat down in the same too small student chair he'd sat in 2 nights ago, and she thought not for the first time that there was something she liked about a man who didn't make a production of fitting into spaces that weren't built for him. He just fit. He's going to the territorial court next week. Formal investigation. Whitmore's solicitor was already at Hale's office when I left. A solicitor, she said. Which means Whitmore knows he can't manage this one, Nathan said. A solicitor is the move of a man who's decided to negotiate rather than fight. She absorbed that. What does negotiating look like for the Henderson family? Hale thinks restitution is likely. The claim restored or compensation paid. He paused. It won't fix everything. 3 years is 3 years, but it's something. She thought about Tobias Henderson, a man she'd never met who'd come from Ohio with a family and a legitimate claim and had lost it because he'd gotten in the way of Caleb Whitmore's expansion. She thought about how many there were in this county, in this territory, in this country. People who'd been ground down by systems that were too expensive to fight and too entrenched to outrun. She thought about what it meant that a frightened middleman's paper trail and a woman's reconstructed letters and a decade of quiet record-keeping by a man on a bay horse had managed to create enough pressure to make that system flinch, not defeat it. She was not naive enough to think this was defeat, but flinch. And sometimes flinch was the beginning of something. She said, "The board meeting is tomorrow." "I know," he said. "How are you feeling about it?" She considered the question honestly. "Confident," she said, "which is different from certain. Marsh has the reference letters. Darnell is in my corner. Mrs. Calloway has been. She's been more than I expected, actually. She came to me yesterday and asked if she could speak at the meeting in support of the school program. I didn't ask her to. She offered." Something moved through Nathan's expression. "She did that on her own." "On her own," Evelyn confirmed. I think when Mrs. Calloway decides she was used, she doesn't redirect the energy inward. She directs it outward, in a useful direction." He nodded slowly. And Pike was the one she'd been least sure about. The rancher, quiet, self-contained, a man who kept his own counsel and revealed his positions only when he had to. She'd had one real conversation with him at the Mercantile 2 weeks ago, in which he'd asked her exactly 3 questions about her teaching methods, and then nodded and walked away without saying what he thought of the answers. She said, "I don't know. I've done everything I can do. The rest is his decision." Nathan looked at her steadily. "You've done more than enough," he said. Whatever Pike decides, you've built something real here. That doesn't disappear because of a vote. I know, she said. But I'd rather not have to rebuild it from a different angle. He almost smiled. Fair, he said. He stood to go, and she stood too, and they were closer than the room required, which was something that had been happening more frequently, the distance between them. Contracting not through any deliberate move, but through the simple accumulation of proximity of time spent in the same rooms, working on the same problems of two people who had stopped performing the careful management of space between them. He said, dinner, Saturday, assuming tomorrow goes the way it should. Saturday, she agreed. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd been watching evolve for 2 months. The expression that had started as the face of a man making a practical assessment and had become gradually and without ceremony the face of a man who was simply glad to be looking. He left. She sat back down at the desk with the graded papers in front of her and felt the very specific sensation of tomorrow being large in a way she couldn't do anything about tonight. She went to bed early. She slept, which surprised her. She woke at 5, wound the watch, dressed carefully in the better of her 2 dresses, the dark blue wool, the one she'd saved for occasions that mattered, and arrived at the school board meeting at 7:45 for an 8 o'clock start. Henry Marsh was already there, and Darnell and Mrs. Calloway and Pike, who had the expression of a man who had already made his decision and was waiting for the formality of the meeting to make it official, though she couldn't tell yet which way the decision had landed. Whitmore was not there. She had wondered if he might come. He didn't. His absence was its own statement. Marsh called the meeting to order. He presented the reference letters from Fenn, both the character reference and the professional documentation, and he summarized the content with the thoroughness of a man who had read them carefully and appreciated what he'd read. Darnell spoke briefly about Thomas, about the change he'd seen in his son in 6 weeks, about the specific nature of the teaching, and what it had taken to reach a boy that 3 previous teachers had written off. Mrs. Calloway spoke about Clara, about the child who had been bored and was now engaged, who had been causing trouble because she'd had nothing worthy of her attention, and now came home talking about ideas. She spoke when it was her turn for 10 minutes. She described her philosophy, not abstractly, but in specific terms, using specific children and specific challenges and specific results. She talked about what it meant to teach a child who'd been told they were slow. She talked about what comprehension actually required and how it was different from decoding. And she saw in Pike's face as she was speaking the expression of a man recognizing something he'd experienced himself in a long-ago classroom. She stopped at 10 minutes exactly. Not because she was done, she could have gone longer, but because the best arguments knew when they were complete. Marsh said, "Any questions?" Pike said, "Miss Harper, my daughter Ruthie, she's 8. She came home last week and read to me from her Bible passage. Front to back, no stopping." He paused. "She's never done that." Evelyn looked at him. She waited. "I didn't know she was in your class," he said. "She didn't tell me because she said she wanted it to be a surprise." He was quiet for a moment. It was a surprise. Evelyn said, "Ruthie is one of the most determined readers I've taught." She needed someone to believe the determination was an asset rather than a stubbornness. Pike looked at her. He looked at Marsh. He said, "I vote to confirm the position. Permanent full terms, the standard salary." He looked back at Evelyn. "And I think we might discuss a raise at the end of the year if the trend continues." Marsh looked at Darnell, who nodded. At Mrs. Calloway, who said simply, "Confirmed." He looked at the table and back at Evelyn. "The position is yours," he said. "Permanently. Congratulations, Miss Harper." She sat very still for exactly 1 moment. Let it land. Let it be real. Then she said, "Thank you. I won't waste the trust." She walked out of the board meeting into the Thursday morning, and she allowed herself standing on the wooden sidewalk with the spring sun on her face. 1 full minute of feeling exactly what she felt, the specific earned quality of a thing that had been fought for and had held. Not luck. Work. Hers and the work of people who had chosen to stand beside her when they didn't have to. She went to find Nathan. Howe was at the livery, which was where he went on Thursday mornings, and when he looked up from the horse he was checking on and saw her face, he didn't ask. He just said, "Permanent." "Permanent," she confirmed. He set down the hoofpick. He looked at her with the full, uncalculated quality that had been building in his face since the day on the ridge when she'd told him she didn't want him to diminish whatever this was. He said, "I'd like Saturday to be more than dinner." She looked at him. She waited because she'd learned that Nathan Cole said things when he was ready and not before, and that what he said when he was ready was always exactly what he meant. He said, "I've been living on that ranch alone for 11 years. I stopped counting at some point how long it had been since the place felt like anything except a piece of land I was managing. And then," he stopped, started again. "You have a way of making things feel like they're worth something. Not just the things you do, the things around you, the way you sit in a room, the way you ask a question, the way you wound that watch every morning like it's the most important thing." He looked at her directly, with the particular courage of a man who had decided that the cost of not saying a thing was finally higher than the cost of saying it. "I am not asking you to make any decisions. I'm just telling you that I see you, clearly. And I would like the opportunity to keep seeing you formally for as long as you're willing." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the depot platform in the dark, the locked door, the fist she'd driven against it, and the silence that had answered. She thought about sitting on that bench with her suitcase and her watch and her $11.40, and deciding that she would wait and keep waiting until she found something worth holding on to. She said, "I wound that watch because my father wound it every morning without fail, even when he was sick, even near the end. He told me the ritual was more important than the object, that doing the same careful thing every day was how you told yourself you intended to keep going." She paused. "I've been doing that for 2 years, just intending to keep going." Nathan said nothing. She said, "I think I'd like to intend something more than that now." He held her gaze. The thing in his face was fully open now. No door, no careful management, no performance of composure. Just Nathan Cole. 58 years of living and 11 years of grief, and 2 months of Saturday mornings looking at a woman in a blue wool dress on a Thursday morning outside a livery in Willow Creek, Montana, and being completely present for it. He said Saturday. She said Saturday. The registered mail investigation moved faster than anyone in Willow Creek had expected, partly because Tom Hale was a methodical man who had been building towards something like this for years, and moved with great efficiency once the foundation was in place, and partly because Caleb Whitmore's solicitor was a practical man who could read a ledger and understood that the documented evidence was not survivable at trial. The formal settlement came 6 weeks after the board meeting. 3 land claims were restored or compensated, including the Henderson 40 acres. Whitmore did not go to trial. His solicitor negotiated an agreement with the territorial court that involved substantial financial restitution and the formal dissolution of the arrangement with Gerald Pratt, whose cooperation had been the pivotal piece. Pratt himself received a conditional agreement, no charges filed in exchange for complete testimony, and the full handover of his documentation. Evelyn heard the details from Hale directly. He came to the schoolhouse on a Friday afternoon and told her with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had done a job completely. She said, "The women he brought out here, the others." Hale said, "We've identified 4 others who came through Pratt over the past 3 years. 2 left the county. 2 are still here. I've spoken to both." He paused. "One of them, a woman named Ruth Adler, is interested in speaking to you. She's been doing laundry work since she got here. Pratt's records show she was promised clerical employment." Evelyn said, "Send her to me." Hale looked at her with an expression she'd seen before, the assessing look of a man updating a long-held assessment. "The school board's going to hear about this," he said. "What you did, the way you built the case. Marsh is already talking about expanding the school program." "One thing at a time," she said. Ruth Adler came to the schoolhouse the following Monday. She was 24 thin, with the careful eyes of a woman who had been in the wrong situations enough times to have learned to read rooms fast. She stood in the doorway, the way Pratt had stood in the doorway 6 weeks ago, hat in hand. Though in her case, it was a bonnet with the same quality of someone who had rehearsed this moment and was not sure how it would go. Evelyn said, "Come in, sit down." She did. Evelyn said, "What did you want to do before you came here?" Ruth said, "I kept books. For a mill in Ohio. I was good at it." Evelyn looked at her. She thought about her own account books, her father's ledgers, the years she'd spent with numbers that told the truth about things when people wouldn't. She thought about what it meant to be good at something and have it taken away from you by the simple accident of circumstance. She said, "I have a proposal for the school board next month. A community education program reading for adults, basic accounting practical skills. I'm going to need someone to help me run the accounting curriculum." She paused. "It doesn't pay much, yet, but it pays honestly, and it's real work." Ruth looked at her with the expression of someone being offered something they'd stopped expecting to be offered. "Why me?" she said. "Because Pratt's records say you can do it," Evelyn said. "And because you came here expecting work that was promised and deserved to get it." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I don't know anything about teaching." "Neither did I the first time I stood in front of a class," Evelyn said. "You learn the same way everything gets learned. One day at a time with someone beside you who's already done it." Ruth Adler started the following Monday. She was not, as it turned out, a natural teacher in the way Evelyn was. She didn't have the instinct for reading a student's confusion before it became defeat. But she was precise and patient, and she had the particular gift of a woman who had been underestimated herself, which meant she never underestimated the person in front of her. Within a month, she had 3 adult students working through basic bookkeeping with the kind of concentration that came from people learning something they actually needed. The community education program was approved by the board in June. Mrs. Calloway was the one who proposed the formal expansion, which meant it came with the weight of the minister's wife behind it, which meant it passed without significant opposition. Evelyn presented the proposal herself, standing in front of the same 4 board members who had confirmed her permanent position 6 weeks earlier, and she spoke for 15 minutes with the accumulated certainty of a woman who had spent 2 months learning exactly how this town made decisions and had built her argument accordingly. Marsh voted yes before she'd finished the sentence. Nathan was waiting on the sidewalk outside the town hall when she came out. She had not told him to be there. He had simply appeared the way he appeared on Saturday mornings and Thursday evenings, and the occasional Wednesday, when something in the week required the specific quality of his company. She had stopped being surprised by it. She had started quietly and without announcement to expect it, which was a different thing. The movement from relief at his presence to the settled assumption that presence was the natural order. She said, "The program is approved." He said, "I heard Marsh talking about it at the feed store yesterday. He made it sound like his idea." She laughed. It came out fully without management, the laugh of a woman who had stopped being careful about what she let people see. "Marsh is welcome to it," she said, "as long as the program runs." Nathan fell into step beside her, and they walked down the main street of Willow Creek in the June evening with the particular ease of 2 people who had found a rhythm in each other's company and no longer needed to negotiate it. He said, Ruth Adler. "What about her?" "She's good," he said. "I heard her explaining a ledger entry to Jim Briggs this morning. Patient. Clear. Briggs has been confused about his accounts for years, and she had him understanding it in 20 minutes. Evelyn said she needed somewhere to put the ability she already had." He looked at her. "You do that," he said. She glanced at him. "Do what?" "See what people have that they're not using yet," he said. "Thomas Darnell, Ruth Adler. The way you talked about Clara Calloway's boredom, like it was something to be honored instead of managed." He paused. "You see it, and then you find the right place to put it." She thought about that. She thought about whether it was a skill or simply the perspective of a woman who'd spent years having her own abilities underused, misread, or ignored. Perhaps there wasn't a meaningful difference. She said, "You do the same thing." He looked at her. "The Hendersons," she said. "The other claims. You kept those stories because you saw the wrong in them, and you didn't let the size of the man doing the wrong make you forget." She paused. "That's the same thing. Seeing what's real and holding on to it until there's somewhere to put it." He walked beside her, and she could feel him turning that over, the way he turned things over honestly, without rushing to a conclusion. He said, "My wife used to say I saw the world in debts, things owed and things repaid. She thought it made me rigid sometimes. Was she right? Yes, he said. And no. The rigidity was the part that made me useful. The part that made me keep records and not let things go when everyone else did. He paused. The part she was right about was using it as a reason to stay at arm's length. Telling myself the world ran on obligation, rather than on something less calculated. She listened. I used the debts as a reason not to need anything, he said. If I was just repaying what was owed, if I was just useful, I didn't have to be present. I didn't have to want things. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He said, I want things now. I want this. Whatever this is that we're building. I want to keep building it. She looked at him. The evening light was behind him, and she could see his face fully without shadow, and she thought about the first time she'd seen it turn toward her on the platform in the dark, assessing the situation with the same steadiness with which he assessed everything. She thought about how long it had taken both of them to arrive at this particular evening on this particular sidewalk, what it had cost them separately and together, and she thought, yes, this is the right place. This is where the road was always going. She said, I came to Willow Creek with nothing. I know, he said. I am leaving that conversation with nothing, she said. Because nothing is behind us. I'm not building on the nothing. I'm building on everything that came after it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, Evelyn Harper, I would like to ask you to marry me. Not as a transaction. Not as a practical arrangement. Because I am a better man in your company than I am alone, and I have been alone long enough to know the difference. She had not expected it tonight. She had expected Saturday or some carefully chosen moment, the kind of declaration that came with preparation. This was not that. This was a man standing on a sidewalk in the ordinary evening light of a Tuesday in June, saying the true thing without ceremony, because ceremony would have been less honest. She felt the full weight of it, the enormity and the simplicity both at once. She said, yes. He looked at her with an expression she had no name for, yet something new, something that had never been on his face before in any of the hundreds of conversations she'd catalogued. The face of a man arriving somewhere after a very long journey, recognizing the destination, not because he'd planned for it, but because it felt with absolute certainty like where he'd been going. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, just took it and held it, and they stood on the sidewalk in the Tuesday evening of Willow Creek, Montana, and for a long moment neither of them needed to say anything else. They were married in September, in the same church where she'd gone to speak to Mrs. Calloway 6 months earlier. Pastor Calloway performed the ceremony with the particular warmth of a man who had been quietly ashamed of the role his household had played in the early difficulties and was glad of the opportunity to do something better. Mrs. Calloway sat in the front row beside Mrs. Aldrich and Henry Marsh and his wife and Thomas Darnell and his father and Ruth Adler, who came in a dress she'd made herself, and Jim Briggs, who'd learned to read his own accounts and brought his wife, and Clara Calloway, who sat next to Ruthie Pike, and they whispered to each other through the entire ceremony in the way of girls who are too interested in everything to sit still. The Henderson family came. Tobias Henderson, walking with a cane with his wife Margaret and their 3 children, came from the 40 acres they'd gotten back in August. He shook Nathan's hand outside the church afterward, and the 2 men held the handshake for a beat longer than handshakes usually lasted, and nothing was said because nothing needed to be. Evelyn stood beside Nathan on the church steps and watched the people of Willow Creek fill the street around them, and she felt with the complete and settled certainty of a woman who had arrived at the end of a very long calculation that every piece had landed where it was supposed to. She thought about the depot platform, the locked door, the fist, the bench with the suitcase and the cold air and the sound of hoofbeats approaching in the dark. She thought about the moment she'd decided to wait. She had been right to wait. Not because the person she'd been waiting for arrived, he never arrived. Pratt never came, and that was the point. She had been right to wait because waiting had given her the moment to stop looking for a rescue and start building a position. And building the position had made everything else possible. She had not been saved by Nathan Cole. She had been seen by Nathan Cole on a night when she needed someone to see her, and she had gone from there under her own power, and he had been beside her, and that was entirely different and entirely better. He put his hand over hers, where they rested on the railing of the church steps, and she looked at him, and he looked at her in the September afternoon, with all of Willow Creek around them, and she thought, here. This is where I belong. Not because I was brought here, not because I was put here, not because someone decided this was where I should be. Because I stayed, and I fought, and I built it, and I chose it, and it chose me back. The woman who had been left at the depot with nothing had become the woman Willow Creek could not imagine being without. And the man who had stopped his horse in the dark because he recognized something in a stranger's refusal to break had finally stopped keeping his distance from his own life. They had found each other at the end of separate journeys that turned out to be the same journey, and the town they'd helped each other hold on to had become, in the truest sense of the word, home. Not because either of them had been lucky enough to stumble into it, because both of them had been stubborn enough to stay.